All right, so let's get going. I pasted in something into the chat. This is a document where I put in a bunch of copy samples of some copy that I've written and other copy that I'm going to be referencing inside of this. So let's get going. So start storytelling for sales. And I guess the first thing I want to tell you is that I did this. And this, in case you don't know, is this mysterious box. I flew around the world. I got naked. I got locked inside of it for an hour, and I waited for a miracle to happen. And if you're wondering what the hell this is, it's a float tank. And the reason I did it is because I read a story. That story was this book called Altered States, in which a scientist gets into a float tank, and first he starts to see hallucinations, and then he turns into a monkey. And I guess I waited for something like that to happen. It didn't happen. But I think it's a great illustration of this idea that we're wired for story, and the fact that story sells in a way that lots of other things cannot sell, because it puts us into a trance. It puts us into a receptive state and allows messages to slip in that we would be critical about otherwise. And if you want examples of that, there's the Significant Objects project, where basically they took little thrift store things like this hippie teddy bear, $1.50. They wrote a story about it, completely fictional, put it on eBay, and it sold for an average 28 times markup. And if you want more examples that aren't so trivial, this thing here is a dog seatbelt. And through the stories, the kinds of stories I'm going to be sharing with you today, the kind of infrastructure to those stories, we've sold, I think, over $15 million worth of those kinds of products. So the thing, though, is that story is not good enough. And I think if you ask yourself, you're going to see that that's true, because we're not the only marketers who figured out that stories work. And everybody's sending you stories all the time. And most of the time, if you look at your own behavior, you're going to realize that you're not responding to stories. And maybe that's just because you're really not a fit for the product. But lots of times it's also just because the story wasn't pulling its weight. It wasn't doing enough. And that's what we're going to fix in this presentation. Basically, I want to tell you how not to sound like an 8-year-old who tells the story of, I got up and I went to school and I came home, but to inject something extra that actually makes things sell. So there are 3 parts of the presentation today. The first is piercing your message into your prospect's consciousness. Second is penetrating deeper in. And the third is really twisting your message to get the result that you want. So let's get going. The first part, which is piercing into the skull of your prospect. So to get going, we need a beginning snapshot. And this is how we get into the head of a prospect. And what I mean by this is the first few paragraphs or the first few sentences of a story. And the way that I write these and the way that I think is most effective is to make it into a scene. Basically, I'm going to talk more about how you're describing this, but if you look at this image, that's what you want your prospects to feel, and that's what's basically going on inside of that snapshot. This is the opening scene of that TV show Lost. These are the first few seconds, and that's kind of what you're trying to go for with those first few moments of the story that you're writing. Basically, you're looking for the hero of the story to have a confrontation with the situation, with the problem that he's facing. He's maybe been asleep the way this guy's been, and now he's awake, and there's no way for him to avoid what's actually happening in his own life. The undertone of that is that there's drama and energy and emotion, which is basically the engine that drives this entire thing. And those are the first few moments of the story. And also in that initial snapshot, and I'm going to give you plenty of examples of how this works, you have to in some way identify that this is for me and me being the person who's reading. So if you're looking at this thing, first you want drama, but then somehow you have to be able to identify with the person inside. And if you look at the document that I shared with you, then you'll see some of those snapshots, but I'll walk you through a few concrete examples right now. The key thing is that all of these have to have some sort of dominant emotion or sensation. And I've collected a bunch of the editorials and the emails that I've written, and I've seen that some of the most successful ones keep going back to the same emotions. So one of these, of course, is just pain. This is an example of an advertorial that ran to cold Facebook traffic for years, I believe, probably made tens of thousands of sales, probably totaling in the millions of dollars. And again, this is the snapshot. So it's somebody waking up, stepping out of bed, and experiencing extreme pain. It's not a lot of buildup. It's just that one specific snapshot. A second emotion is fear, also very powerful. This example is from Stefan Georgi from a sales letter that he shared at some point. It's for an Alzheimer's drug or supplement, and it's about this guy going to his father's house, his father not recognizing him and pulling out a shotgun because he thinks he's an intruder. Third emotion, shame, very powerful. One of the most successful stories that has been running direct response circles is this guy who wants to have a girlfriend, and he goes to this girl's house that he really likes with presents, with flowers, and some other guy shows up at the door half naked, and the girl shows up behind him wearing nothing but a bedsheet. Guilt, another one that is very common, very powerful. The best example of this that I could think of came from a presentation by Chris Haddad, who actually writes very much in the way that I'm going to be describing today. So he calls it punch in the gut stories, pig stories. And the example that he gave is he was selling a ClickBank product, and it was for home energy, saving on energy, or having your own home generator. And rather than it being a logical thing about how you can save money, about this little girl coming into the living room, and it's the middle of the winter in Nebraska. It's cold, and she says, "Daddy, I'm cold because the energy has been turned off." Despair, this is from a VSL that I wrote. It's kind of a classic rags to riches story. The guy was desperate. He needed money. The deal was going south. He was in debt, and he was forced to call his parents to give him a loan, and they said no. Disgust, one final emotion. This has worked very well for the kinds of e-commerce products that I've sold a lot of. This is just turning some sort of product into drama. In this case, it's a physical reaction. You put your hand to your face and you feel a bad smell. And this is a snapshot of just capturing that rather than saying, you know how it is when you smell something bad, which is not as powerful as putting it into a snapshot. This guy is Dave Chappelle. You probably know him because he is a fantastic storyteller. And I put him here because some of the stuff that I've, basically shared with you so far, it's very dramatic. And you might be wondering if you really need to go that heavy, whether you need to be talking about fear and despair. And the thing is that in some situations, if you can get away with it, then absolutely you should, if it makes sense in that specific case. If it doesn't, and it doesn't in many cases, it doesn't make sense to talk about despair if you're selling, a mosquito repellent, which is one of the products I'll show you, or you can find in that document. In that case, you can take whatever it is that you're selling, put it into a situation that is as dramatic as possible. So Dave Chappelle, he had a story about going into the ghetto, seeing a baby on the corner, and then that's how he realized that he was in a bad part of town. And that's basically what I'm talking about, because this last example, with the sponge, it's drama out of nothing, and that's what I'm saying. You can turn anything and make it more dramatic by thinking about how to do that, by thinking of what turns you off or on, and then also there's some tricks. I'll talk about the tricks in a second. The other thing is, though, the examples that I've given you so far and everything that we're going to be talking about is mostly geared towards cold traffic, which means you got to capture people right away and hit them in the most dramatic possible way. If you're doing relationship-based marketing, which means that you're sending out daily emails to people who know you, or you have a Facebook group, or you're somehow communicating with people who know you, you can't keep sending them fear-based emails every day. That's going to get very exhausting. You can do it a lot, but you can't do it every day. You can still make your content emotional in various different ways. You can have a different cast of emotions, the way that Star Trek doesn't feature the same aliens in every episode. Some are more popular, some are more effective, but still they mix it up, and that's what you should do as well. So that's a caveat. I'm not going to talk much about email marketing or that kind of relationship-based marketing, but keep in mind that emotions are good, dramatic emotions are really good, particularly to cold traffic, but if you're sending it to people who are reading your stuff every day, you have to be a little bit more unpredictable. Before we get into the actual how-to of the snapshot that I've been telling you about, this guy here is William Goldman, and he was a famous screenwriter. He wrote The Princess Bride and The Marathon Man, which we saw in that previous shot. I bring him up because he had this idea that in a movie, you don't want to grab people right away. You have time to build up the scene. And in sales copy, that depends. If you're going to cold traffic, then you don't have time. You basically have to think of it the same way that you would think on TV, right? So it has to be very, very quick. You have to grab people's attention right away. If you are doing again, some sort of relationship marketing, if you're writing some sort of different piece where people know you, where they're getting sucked into the message, you don't need to bleed in the first line. Bleed in the first line is a line by James Altucher. So a lot of these stories that I'm going to be showing you are going to bleed in the first line. So there's immediately some drama. There's very little buildup. And that's very good for cold traffic. Again, if you're not writing to cold traffic, you might want to tone it down because people might be wondering why you're trying to manipulate them in that way all the time. Okay, so now the how-to of actually write the kinds of snapshots that I've told you. And the main thing to keep in mind is that you don't need to have an enormous backstory, or you don't need to have any backstory at all. You need to think in terms of snapshots again. So think of a movie trailer or literally like a comic book describing what's happening in each panel of the comic book. So this is from the first Batman. And this in a way would be this would already probably be too big as a story for an advertorial snapshot in the beginning. But in another kind of story, this could be, this could definitely be kind of the initial snapshot that sucks people in. So family walking down the street, they're very happy. Out of the darkness, there's a gunman, a shot fires, and the boy is left alone, standing on the street with a bunch of spilled popcorn behind him, right? So that's a very, very succinct picture that people can see, right? You're not explaining too much. It's not necessarily logical. It's not linear. People can see it. And that's exactly the kind of storytelling that I'm talking about. And this is that first part of that sphere. This is how you get into people's heads. You think visually and you present your ideas visually, and then people see that and they want more, right? The way that you can actually come up with the snapshot is to allow yourself to write the story as you would write it. So most of us, we like to have too much backstory. We go in, we explain a lot, we give a lot of irrelevant details, and after 20 minutes of storytelling or 5 pages, we finally get to the kind of the highlight, the money shot, the payoff, right? One way you can write these snapshots for the beginning of your story is to allow yourself to write all that stuff that you feel you need to get out. You finally get to the climax, and then you just rip it out and put it out into the front. And that's exactly what's happening with that movie, Bohemian Rhapsody. If you've never seen the movie, it's the movie about Freddie Mercury and Queen. It's very straightforward. Freddie Mercury is young, then he joins Queen, then they go have ups and downs, and finally they have this climactic appearance at Wembley Stadium where they go on stage in front of 1 billion people and the crowd goes wild. Except that the movie, rather than telling that fairly linear and boring story, they rip out the scene about Wembley, put it in the front without any explanation. It goes for the first 5 minutes, and then we go back to the beginning and we relive the whole thing. And you can do the same. Another way to make this thing exciting and make it dramatic, even if you don't really have a dramatic story, is to talk about physical reactions. In that document that I shared with you, you'll find several examples of it. But basically, rather than using a lot of adjectives and saying, oh my God, I was so horrified, I was terrified, I was furious, you describe what happens to that. So if you look at that cat, right, that cat is having a specific physical reaction to some sort of scary thing. And all of us do the same, right? We suck in our breath, tighten up our shoulders, we back away, our eyes get wider, we start to speak fast, whatever. By describing those things, you bring in drama much more than by using adjectives. So use that stuff. And if you want examples, take a look at the document that I shared with you. And finally, this is the last part of the snapshot for the beginning. As with every other part of the story, you need to have a cliffhanger. There needs to be a moment of, there's this thing, but now you need to know what happens next. There are two ways you can do that. It either can be the story is so naturally unfinished and exciting that people need to keep going, or if not, then you do the typical clickbait thing where you say, I thought it was bad, and then I wasn't even ready for what was going to happen next. Let me tell you about it. So it can either be kind of natural and organic, or it can be mechanical. All right, so I believe that covers all of the snapshot stuff, and I've covered a lot of stuff for just these first few paragraphs, the first few lines of the story. And honestly, for the stories that I've written that have been the most successful, even though these are literally, this is maybe a half page of copy, but this is the part where I spend the most time. I'll tell you exactly where you can find these stories, but a lot of research goes into just finding a really good dramatic snapshot to suck people in. Everything that comes later is much more formulaic. This is the part where I really need to figure out who are the people that I'm writing to, what are they scared about, what is going to trigger them, and how can I put that in a visual format of 1, 2, 3 pictures that I can show them right away so that they're sucked in and so they identify with the story and they want to find out more. So now that I told you that, the less you write of this snapshot, the better the result is going to be. And what I mean by that is you have to research, as much as possible. And ideally, you're going to find something that you can use whole cloth. This is Vanilla Ice, by the way, and because the song that he had was a success because of the Queen sample that he ripped off. But that's what I'm telling you to do, basically. Go out, find stories that are told by the marketplace that you're targeting, and take those stories, condense them, make them more exciting, or not even more exciting, just make them clearer than what they were, and put that in as your snapshot. There's nothing better than you can do. Actually, let me stick there just for a second, because while that is the ideal case where you don't actually make up anything, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes there's simply no good story that you can find that is exactly what you need. And in that case, there are a few alternatives that I use. Again, you'll see some of the examples of that if you take a look at the document that I shared. But the main thing that you want to do is you need to have drama, you need to have emotions, and you need to have details. So if you don't find a story that fits all of that stuff, then you can have a framework in your mind of a possible scene that would work. Then fill that with details that you find from online. One example that I have of this, and I share that in the document, is for vitamins for kids who are kind of hyperactive. And the opening scene is this mom in a supermarket, and the kid is going wild. She can't control him. The kid is pulling things off the shelf. A crowd of people is gathering around. The mom is embarrassed. She can't control her kid. She finally starts to drag him out of the store. And that's kind of the initial snapshot. I didn't find any kind of story that was exactly like that. I found a bunch of different stories where people mention details about their kids having tantrums, about how embarrassing things that their kids did were, all these parts. And I kind of took all of those details and put it into that framework or that skeleton that I had of that story idea. Another thing is that you can use stories from your own experience. I've done this a lot, especially in emails, not only the emails that I write to my own list, but also for clients. It doesn't necessarily need to be the exact story. So for example, If you are selling kids supplements, it doesn't need to be a story about how your own kid had a bad story, but it can simply be a story of you being really embarrassed by something that was out of your own control. And then you can fit that emotion and that personal experience that you had into that framework. Okay, so how would it feel if I had a kid and something was going on as well? And sometimes you don't have anything like that. Sometimes ultimately you have to make it up and you have to write it. I've written some things that were successful, but that's really my last resort. Ideally, you want to take stuff that the market gives you and just feed it back to the market. And this concludes the first part of this presentation, but let me see how we're doing here and if there's anybody else here. So any questions at this point? Okay, then let me keep going. So the next step is, now that we've had that initial snapshot, the rest of the story, like I said, is much more formulaic in the sense that once we've sucked people in, then there's kind of a formula that I default to, or several different formulas. But the underlying structure is that we've had an initial snapshot, and now there are going to be several more snapshots and several more kind of discourses in between that explain stuff that's been going on. So, if you have a snapshot where it's just somebody at the supermarket and the kid is screaming, now you need to explain a little bit of the backstory. And that's where kind of the typical storytelling that most of us want to engage in comes in, right? That's where you give the backstory that you find interesting, but that you need to mix in with the snapshots. And the reason I have a picture of this is Ben-Hur, the movie of the Sermon on the Mount, and this is exactly how the Gospels are organized. So there's a series of stories. Jesus goes, he visits this house, he goes across the sea. There's a story, and then there's teachings, right? There's kind of an explanation of the philosophy of Jesus, right? And that's what the Sermon on the Mount is. So snapshot, story, images, and then explanations guiding you along, so you actually get the message that the story is supposed to be conveying to you. The typical outline of the story that I write and that I'm recommending to you is that initial snapshot, which is the first part here, which we've already covered. This is where the hero is faced with the problem, and this is non-negotiable. So basically, in any kind of a story, even if it's completely cut down, I use this kind of beginning. So that's non-negotiable. The second step is things get even worse and nothing helps. So here's an example of that from an advertorial that I wrote. This is for a plantar fasciitis insult, so for heel pain. So first, there was a moment where the guy got out of bed, it was horrible pain, and then he thought it was going to get better, but it didn't. It got worse, kept getting worse, 1 day, 2 days, and eventually even had to start taking time off of work. I'll explain why this is important later, but this is kind of the typical structure. And then another important thing is to dismiss all the alternatives out there. And the way that you do this is basically by saying, I tried them. I found out what the problem was, and I went out there, I got all the recommendations that everybody is going to hear about, and they did nothing for me for different reasons, right? And basically what you're doing here is, what you're dismissing alternatives, B, you're kind of pacing their experience so far. So in this case, maybe they have the pain, maybe they've tried some of these examples, but then you're also leading them further, right? Because what you're actually saying is, I've tried everything, even maybe things that you haven't tried. And also I started having even maybe worse problems than what you're facing right now, which is another important kind of psychological thing that I'm going to discuss a bit later. For now, just realize that you start with the problem and then you make the problem even worse and nothing fixes it. And then finally, of course, eventually you have to hit upon the solution and then look at me now and look at how well things are going for me. In terms of the structure, there are some common elements that I found to work very well, and that aren't just in the stories that I've written, but in lots of other stories. And they work, A, because we're used to them and we kind of expect them, and B, there's some secret psychology that I'll talk about later and explain why these things work. So one of them is the accidental discovery, right? So Peter Parker gets bitten by a radioactive spider. Bruce Banner gets irradiated by X gamma rays or whatever it is. Our brains really love some sort of chance things happening, and this works very well in stories because it captures our attention and makes us more interested and makes us believe in a way we wouldn't believe otherwise. Plus, there's some other reasons why this is important in the stories that I'll cover in a bit later. But for now, if you can work in some sort of accidental discovery, it's great because it works very well in stories. Another example is chance encounters, like this Before Sunset or Sunrise movie. This is basically, I would never have been able to solve this problem myself, but I ran into somebody completely accidentally and he revealed the trick to me. So very powerful thing that I use a lot. And the third thing is, in terms of common elements that I keep reusing and that I see everywhere, is that there is initial skepticism, right? So it's not that you come across somebody, they tell you, here's the solution, you say, oh my God, that's fantastic, and all my problems are solved. No, of course. It's like Bridget Jones here. Her mom introduces her to this new guy. He's a lawyer, he's very handsome, and he's single. And she meets him, and look at him, right? He's wearing this ridiculous, ugly Christmas jumper. And that's basically the attitude that the hero in the story has to take towards the solution. So he or she looks at the solution, they say, this is not going to help me. I've either tried this or this is just something that is completely ridiculous. All right, then moving on, the final section, which is about twisting kind of the blade inside of somebody's body. And I've kind of given you an overview of, how you actually get the attention of people in the beginning, how you get their interest, which was, the attention was the snapshot initially. The interest was kind of the structure that we've just covered. The desire is building through both of those parts. And I want to highlight some of the reasons why that desire builds so that you can work it into the stories that you write as well. So the first thing is that the reason that stories work, if they work for selling, is because drama and tension are primary, right? You need to build that drama, that misery, that identification with the prospect, and the hero. And then the solution, it really only comes after that. Some of the products that I've sold were really generic products. There was no way to really sell the product directly by itself. So instead, what the story did was build up a lot of drama, eliminate any other options, and then basically say, and this is what I wound up getting and I'm happy with it. And talking about the actual product was minimal. And if you read my email last night, so basically this is a very dramatic illustration of that. North by Northwest, Alfred Hitchcock's movie, 2 hours, 14 minutes, 16 seconds is drama, tension, building up to the climax, which is the cliffhanger that we saw before. Cary Grant is pulling up Eva Marie Saint off the cliff, and then he pulls her up, and he actually pulls her up into the bed of the train, whatever compartment that they're staying in, right? So the last 43 seconds is basically two scenes. That's the happy ending. So 2 hours and 14 minutes of tension and misery, 43 seconds of happy ending. Of course, you can't really do that in a sales setting, but that's a good thing to keep in mind in terms of not really talking about the solution very much. And of course, like I talked about before, you've got to move people along, right? So at every point during the story that you're writing, you have to keep something hidden, right? So in the beginning, you start the story, the end of the story is unknown, right? And then maybe you reveal a little bit more, but as you reveal a little bit more, you hide another part, right? So there's always something that's moving people along. I compared this once to basically giving IOUs, if you have in the beginning of the story or in the beginning of your sales message, you're giving the reader an IOU and you're saying, give me 2 minutes of your time and I'm going to give you some valuable information. In that 2 minutes, you do give them something valuable, But in the meantime, you're giving them other IOUs. So basically, you're paying off some of that debt, but you're making new debt so the reader keeps sticking around. One specific example I can think of is Paris Lampropoulos talked about this in a webinar where he was talking about an Alzheimer's cure, a doctor who who had a husband with Alzheimer's, and basically the question was, you have these three parts. You have the person, the current situation that they're in, you have the solution, and then you have the outcome. And you can choose which part of that you hide, right? So usually you start with the problem that you're in, but then, for example, you can jump to the outcome and you can say, the most incredible thing happened, everything is great, but then the person still doesn't, your reader doesn't know what the solution was and how you got there. And that's what keeps them reading. Alternately, you can say, here's the problem that I was in, here's something that I tried, but then they're still stuck reading because they want to find out what the outcome was. So always you have to hold something back. And the reason we do this is the more people read, the more they buy. So even if, for example, in an advertorial, lots of times there are links to the product page earlier in the copy than not just at the end. Ultimately, we really don't want to put in links too early because the more people read, the better the chances that they're actually going to buy. And now the secret psychology of the stuff that I've been talking about. So these are things that are explanations for some of the things that I've talked about. There are also things that you can probably work into copy that you're writing yourself. And I think by highlighting them, I hope that it's going to bring them to mind the next time that you're writing. I wouldn't necessarily start with these things, but there are things that you can work into copy that you've already written. And I think once you do it a few times, it's going to become more automatic, where once you write stories, you're going to realize that by working in these elements, it makes your stories stronger, more persuasive, more engaging. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that there are two kinds of groups of problems. And if you look back at the emotions that I talked about, there are problems like pain, like fear, right? And these are situations in which we are basically protecting kind of our body, right? That's the way I think about it. In those situations, ideally what we would really like to have is other people where we could have strength in numbers, right? But if you're trying to make a more dramatic story about pain or fear, then what you really want to do is isolate people, right? So you're not going to have necessarily a story about pain where that person is in pain, but their family is all around and they're trying to help and they're consoling this person and trying to make the situation better, right? So if somebody's in pain, and even if they have family around them, don't bring that up. Don't bring up the family. Just make this person the only character there is in that story. That brings in this feeling of isolation, which makes the story more dramatic and makes that emotion stronger. But on the other hand, there's kind of a second batch of emotions that we've covered, or that I've usually used in these stories, which is things like shame and humiliation and guilt, right? And these are situations in which we're basically trying to protect not our body, but we're trying to protect our self-image, basically our face, our position in society, our relationship to other people. And if somebody's ashamed, then ideally if somebody's ashamed, they want to be alone. They don't want their shame to be exposed in any way. And then, of course, what we want to do is we bring in an audience. So, for example, in that story that I had with the mom and the kid having a tantrum, that story was about frustration, but at the same time, the core emotion in that beginning of that advertorial was really the shame of not being able to control the kid, the guilt over having done something wrong, the shame of other people looking and saying she's such a bad mother, right? And the way that worked, the way that I put that thing into the supermarket rather than just the kid having a tantrum at home, is because then there are other people who could point fingers and say, look at her, what a terrible mom she is. And that's what makes stories more dramatic without necessarily using hype adjectives, but just kind of more subtle psychology. Another really important thing is that a lot of the elements of everything I've told you about so far are actually absolving people of both work and guilt. Ultimately, we're telling stories because we want people to buy. We want people to buy the solution that we're selling, right? So we don't want people to say, I can take care of this problem myself. And we don't want people to be so overwhelmed with guilt that they think that they cannot or will not or don't deserve a solution at all. So, for example, one of the reasons that the accidental discovery or the chance encounter works really well, and that's why I said this is one of the common elements that keeps popping up in so many stories. One of the reasons that it works really well is basically because it's saying the person who's telling the story, all of their lucky stars had to align, right? This was kind of a once in a lifetime situation where either they accidentally found the solution or they ran into somebody who was a complete stranger or very unlikely to come across them, and that person provided the solution. And basically what that's saying is that there's no way that you can go out and try to figure this out on your own. You can't just sit around and hope that the solution is going to come to you, because this is a really rare event. And one of the things that this does is, yeah, it eliminates other options, but it also kind of like absolves people from well, I think, the main thing is that basically like makes it so people have to follow your own solution, right? And that's one of the reasons, for example, in many stories, when people are talking about how they found the solution, they say, oh, it just popped up on my Facebook feed. And I really don't like that. I feel like it's very weak when they say just an ad popped up, because if an ad popped up for you, if you saw it on TV, if you read about it in the newspaper and it's just a generic newspaper, then okay, I'm going to find out about it, right? So you want that extra level of unlikelihood and drama, because in that case, there's no hope for me to find that on my own. And the other thing is that, yeah, it also, the story itself and all the things that I've tried in the story and that didn't work, that absolves me of work. And it also absolves me of guilt, in the sense that I probably haven't tried everything out there. I've tried maybe one thing. Maybe I haven't tried any of these things, but I believe that they don't work, or maybe I believe that they could work, just not for me. And now I have somebody here in the story, through their own story, telling me they tried it, they didn't work. It didn't work for them. And this partly kind of matches my own beliefs and experiences, but it also absolves me of guilt, because I know that I should have been trying maybe harder to fix my problem, but I haven't done so, and it's actually okay, because it wouldn't have worked anyhow. Another hidden psychology thing is that we want to make things worse than they initially were, right? So things are bad in the beginning, and then they keep getting worse, which is, again, we're kind of pacing and leading. So we meet people where they are. They probably have that problem initially, the problem we start with the snapshot in the beginning with. But then we take it much, much further than what people have probably experienced, right? So we paint all the bad possible outcomes of this thing that happened to us that probably haven't happened to these people yet, right? So one of the examples I have in the document that I shared is dog seatbelt advertorial, where the initial snapshot is somebody gets into an accident and the dog is in the back, and she's shaking and shaken, but it's all okay because she was wearing a seatbelt. But then there's a sequence of stories that the police officer who comes tells the woman, and in that case, it's all the terrible things that can happen if a dog isn't wearing a seatbelt, and you haven't thought about any of them. So one of them is that the dog can injure the person in the car. Another is that the driver can injure random innocent passers-by because he's not driving carefully. A third thing is that you get into an accident, the dog runs off in the middle of the highway. The fourth thing is that the dog jumps out of the car. So a bunch of other stories that kind of like create the problem and make the situation much, much worse than it was. And, again, the point of that is to say, if you think that things are bad now, you haven't seen anything yet. And that creates kind of subtle urgency to solve the problem now rather than say, maybe I can keep dealing with it. Because basically what this is saying is, if you think things are bad now, you haven't seen anything yet, right? An extra thing is, psychological thing is that the entire story creates trust, right? So the entire story is all about sharing your own story and being as extremely unokay as possible. This is another one of the reasons why the stories that I write, they often go to the extremes and they get into ridiculous situations. One of them is this thing that I just talked about, that you basically want to make people believe or understand that the current situation they're in could get much worse. But the other one is that it just creates sympathy on part of the reader, right? Because if people have had really bad situations, if they themselves are failures, if they're frustrated, if they are desperate, this psychologically in a lot of situations makes people less skeptical, makes people less critical and more willing to trust you, right? So the more miserable your story is, of course, as long as you can make it convincing, but the more miserable it is, the more likely it is that the person feels that your story is so bad that they basically pity you and therefore they trust you more. And the final thing is that the stories are also a vehicle to validate what people's kind of deep down feelings and emotions are, right? So one of the things that Trump did really well was validate a lot of things that for a long time up till then had kind of been secret unspoken feelings of a large part of the American population, right? When you're writing stories, the story itself is a vehicle to do that as well. And if you take a look at some of the samples that I shared with you, you'll see that. For example, that story with the kid in the supermarket, right? If you read a little bit more of that story that I share with you, it's basically the mom is not just frustrated with the kid. She is desperate. She's worried about her own marriage. She's thinking that she's done something wrong. And there's a subtext that she basically doesn't like her kid, which is something that, I found on the internet a lot. There were a lot of parents who couldn't handle their kids who were hyperactive and who were basically saying, I feel responsible for my kid. I love my kid in the same way that every parent loves their kid, but honestly, I don't like my kid and I can't stand his behavior and he's driving me crazy, right? So working in those kinds of hidden emotions that people cannot really voice to themselves, it's another way to bring trust and to really kind of make it so that so that people trust you and so that they open up emotionally as well to you, as well as you opening up to them, right? Now, this is basically the end of everything that I had to tell you. So there are the 3 parts. We've covered them. You get that in there. The initial snapshot, that's how you capture attention. That's how you get people to identify with the story that you're telling. Then you have kind of this formulaic 3-part structure of, okay, we've captured attention by telling some sort of a snapshot, facing the problem. The next step was walking through all the alternatives as the problem keeps getting worse. And then finally, we've solved the problem through some accidental discovery or chance encounter. I want to tell you how to actually use this by yourself and how not to use it. So the first thing is that I'd say use your instincts first in terms of if you're writing a story, write down the story that comes to mind first, right? At least some of the time. All of the stories that I've shown you, 90% of them, I wrote them based on the research that I'd done, and somehow once all that research was there, I said, okay, how can I put this together? And your brain, if you've watched enough movies, which all of us have, if you watched enough TV, we have these story templates in our head, and you can see how to put those pieces together, right? And lots of times your subconscious is going to do this in the best possible way. If you don't have any ideas, then kind of the template that I've walked you through before, which is that 3-part template, that works, right? So, here's where I was, here's how I was bad, here's how it got worse and everything that I tried, and here's finally the solution that worked for me, right? So you can always use that template. But if you try things out yourself, if you allow your brain to come up with solutions, you might come up with other templates as well, which is stuff that I've done as well. So there are other basic structures that I've used in storytelling. I didn't walk through them because they're probably much less useful than the one that I've used, but they worked very well for the products that they were selling. So one of them, for example, is what I call the Red Shoe Diaries thing. If you don't know Red Shoe Diaries, it was this kind of like cable wannabe porn TV show, like erotic TV. And what it was each episode was this guy reading a couple of stories that were mailed into him, a couple of letters, and he would read it, and then it would basically become the story. So that's the framework that I used for some of the stories where I told, where basically it was just one character who comes in, and then that character is telling a few inside stories. For example, that dog seatbelt thing that I talked about, right? So there's an accident, the police officer comes, and the police officer tells 3 or 4 additional snapshot horror stories about bad things that happened that you would never know about if you don't have a dog seatbelt for your car. The other thing is that you can basically make it into an infomercial. So again, that's what I was saying, that you can kind of switch the order of what's not known in your story. There was a very successful product that we promoted with stories, and basically what it was an initial snapshot about a mom who had to wash some bloody clothes, and then she kept washing other clothes. And it was, first she was washing some really dirty socks, then she was washing some really dirty towels, and she was washing, everything was kind of escalating, and every time that you thought, okay, what is this thing? But the solution was never revealed. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is, if you think about the product, if you think about the marketplace, and if you allow yourself and your brain to come up with different structures, you might come up with a better solution, because in certain situations, that kind of framework that I gave you might not be the optimal framework. But that said, if you don't have anything, then keep going back to the well, and I've definitely done that many times. And the final thing that I want to share with you is, if you find storytelling intimidating in some way, if you think it is a unique skill, it's actually much less so than you might think. As I've been putting this together, I realized how much of the stories that I tell are actually, and how much they have in common with writing bullets, right? And how the same skills go into writing a good bullet as into presenting a story that is good at making sales. So front loading, that thing that I said about, you want to put something exciting at the beginning of the bullet to suck people in, either a promise, or if you don't have a promise, just pull in an exciting word to the front of the bullet, whether it's newsflash, amazing, something. The same thing is basically the snapshot that we're putting at the beginning of the story. The second thing is specificity, right? So bullets, I think we've covered in a million different ways why specificity is really important in bullets, and how you can use the numbers and details and when you're teasing things. And it's the exact same thing with stories, right? Except in stories, it's not necessarily numbers, but it's all those details that I talked about, where this is really the reason why you do the research, right? Because there's no way, one of that story about the mom who has to wash the bloody clothes. So I found that story on Amazon, and basically it was an Amazon, comment, and the comment said, my son cut his finger on a mandarin slicer, right? And that went into the editorial as is, because it gives it this uniqueness that I would never have thought about, but it makes it much more believable and much more exciting. Intrigue and drama, I think that's clear. Basically, we're stirring up emotions with kind of high stakes and drama, even if there isn't any. Extremes as well, bullets, best, number one, things like that. In stories, it's more about taking the story to the extremes, right? So making things as dramatic as possible, the consequences as bad as possible, but the underlying psychological thing is the same. And then again, dark psychological things, a lot of the same things that work in bullets. So guilt, fear, shame, greed, all of those things get worked in both into bullets and stories. And those are the things that really make things effective. Teasing, you always have to keep something hidden. And then repetition, right? So repetition is very effective in bullets. You want to repeat the same thing multiple times. And in some ways, the story is doing the same, right? So you keep repeating the fact that things are bad, things are bad, things are getting worse. There is a magical solution. Let me tell you more about it. So you're repeating things over and over and over. And I believe that is everything that I wanted to cover, except I realized I skipped across one thing, which was telling you how to actually find that initial snapshot. So if you look in the document that I shared with you, I have a few tips that I shared. My best advice is to go on Reddit. Reddit is the most amazing resource for finding stories and snapshots that you can work into your copy. Oftentimes you can work it in as is. I've done this a lot with emails, with editorials. I've usually had to do more research and tighten things up. But basically just by going on Google and searching Reddit on Google for the problem that you're talking about. So for example, if you're writing about plantar fasciitis, then type in site:/reddit.com plantar fasciitis, and then put in story or rant or so bad in quotes. And I put all of these search terms in that document so you can find them there. That's how you can find lots of stories that people write. And lots of times the story is not actually in the post, in the thing that people write, but somewhere in the comments. So it's worthwhile reading those as well. And Reddit is divided up into subreddits, which are basically bulletin boards on different topics. And once you identify a good subreddit for something that you're writing about, for example, there was this vitamins thing that I wrote about, and there are all of these mom subreddits. Then within there, you can search for, again, using the search within Reddit, you can search for the problem, stories, rants. Those are actually specific search terms that you can use. And again, if you check out that document that I shared with you, you'll find it there, what I used. There are other forums online as well that are going to be specific to the market that you are writing to. But just Google whatever the topic is plus forum and you'll find that. Forums, I found forums and Reddit are the best because usually people are not using their real name, and that's why they will share all sorts of crazy stories that they would never share on Facebook or anywhere where they can be identified. Another tip is that lots of times it makes sense to search for kind of a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself. So, using that hyperactivity example for the vitamin editorial that I was writing, hyperactivity, let's say, is the problem, right? So I can search for hyperactivity on Reddit and find stories related to that. But then really the symptom that I wanted to look at was like a tantrum or a meltdown, or like a meltdown in a supermarket. So if you think about symptoms like that, often you can find snapshots that are ready-made for you to use. And two other places that you can look beyond Reddit are, well, let's say actually that's it. So Reddit and forums, and then another place is Amazon, both in the reviews. On Amazon, in my experience, there are tons of fake reviews and tons of really lame fake reviews that aren't going to be useful at all. But sometimes you can get lucky, and sometimes the fake reviews can be useful because basically it's some marketer out there who's done the research, figured out what the three main pain points are of your market, and kind of weave together a testimonial based on that. And you can use that copy straight up to, to inform your own copy, right? And I believe that is all. So, so Jim is asking drama, emotion. Please explain more about emotion. Well, I guess the point, emotion, I think, is all the stuff that we talked about kind of at the beginning of this talk, which was that if you're telling a story, right, I think the key thing is that you don't want to just tell a story and then try to squeeze in an emotion into it. Rather than that, when you are selling a product, when you're thinking about selling a product and thinking about the story that you want to tell, think about an emotional situation in which somebody would be. I guess I'm not explaining that very well, but basically I'm trying to say is think of the emotion first and then find a story or a snapshot that would fit that. So again, let me go back to this advertorial example of the mom with the kid, right? So if it's hyperactivity and the kid is hyperactive, well, fine, the kid is hyperactive, right? So I need to make that dramatic somehow. If the kid is hyperactive, there's nothing emotional in there. So it could be something like the mom feels miserable, out of control, she's going crazy. All of those are okay, but they're not dramatic enough, right? And so that's why I keep kind of going back to like, what would be more extreme? What would be more extreme? And then you start, again, you ask yourself those kinds of questions. What would be more extreme? Or you can just dig into the market, right? You start reading through those stories, or you basically ask your subconscious, what would be a more extreme situation if you have a hyperactive kid? For me, as soon as I asked myself that, I imagined a mom holding a bunch of bags, trying to make her way through a supermarket, and she has this kid. The kid is screaming. He's being obnoxious. He's grabbing things off the shelf. She's trying to calm him down, and that's bad. But then you have people around you who are basically, starting to look and starting to point, starting to shake their head. And so in that case, the most dramatic, or the emotion really is shame. So that's kind of the core emotion of that specific thing. So I would say, rather than trying to tell the story and then squeeze emotion in, maybe start with the emotion, an emotion that is strong enough to really drive a story, and then try to find stories that would illustrate that emotion well. Does that help? If not, ask me some more specific question and I'll try to answer. Nope, nothing. Okay, well, I guess I will end on that note, unless, Jim, you have any other questions? And if not, then I think we'll finish here. Yeah, no worries. I'm glad I could do this. I think it was very useful for me. And if you haven't taken a look at that document, take a look at it. I'll send out an email later today with the recording of this call, with the document, and I guess with the slides if anybody wants them. And thank you very much. And thanks for being part of the Bullets course. And I'll talk to you later.